Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman.
This week on Heroic Media, 4 U.S. Catholic publications issue a joint statement urging an end to the death penalty.
Pope Francis has strong criticism for gender theorists.
50 Shades of Grey raises some interesting questions about the impact of movies on culture.
Stay tuned for all these stories and more here on Heroic Media. So here at Heroic Media, we discuss news headlines that deal with foundational moral issues. We look at issues of family, marriage, and life, really because those are the fundamental building blocks of our society.
That's right, and a lot of times the stories we'll cover will be around abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
Exactly. So Patrick, what's our first story?
All right, in our first story, 4 U.S. Catholic publications with a broad range of audiences have come together in a joint editorial calling for an end to the death penalty in the United States. So this is kind of a rare situation, right?
Very
Where
rare.
you have so many different, I mean, they are all under the kind of the Catholic umbrella, but it's kind of rare when you have publications like this, that different viewpoints sometimes that come together to unite on one specific thing, and I think it's quite timely, and
Yeah, absolutely.
and it's good to see companies come together for this type of positive reinforcement.
Absolutely. So we've got the National Catholic Register,
Yep.
Our Sunday Visitor, America
Yes.
Magazine, and the National Catholic Reporter. Interestingly, the Reporter has taken editorial stances against church teaching, and so there's some question as to the authenticity of their Catholic identity. But I think what's really happening here is we have an effort to build bridges and say, okay, let's find areas of agreement and let's find areas of dialogue and stand up for church teaching. And Pope Francis talks about encounter and trying to lead to a deeper and better commitment to church teaching. So I think that's what we have happening here.
Absolutely. You're meeting on common ground for a good cause. I mean, and just how the editorial starts, abhorrent, it's saying that it's abhorrent and unnecessary when talking about the death penalty. And, just talking about how resources are drained, setting up systems and death penalty systems and things like this. And, it also says that, we would be better deployed in preventing crime, those funds and resources in the first place, and working toward restorative justice for those who commit less heinous crimes. So, they hit on a bunch of different topics, but all focusing on, they had the same line of thought and everything, and it's just good to see some unity on this.
Yeah, I think it's good to just look at church teaching here for a minute, because the death penalty is a little bit of a complex issue. It's not the same as, say, abortion, where the church says this is intrinsically evil, it's never okay. In the case of the death penalty, the church actually says it's okay to use the death penalty if this is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against the unjust aggressor. That's right from the Catechism. So what that's saying is, if there are non-lethal means that are sufficient to defend and protect people's safety, then that should be used. But if it's a case where you can't do that, then the death penalty is okay. So it's in applying that where you have to sort of figure out whether or not it's okay. And what this editorial is doing is saying, hey, look, it's getting harder and harder in practical cases to actually say it was necessary in this concrete case in the United States, in a first world country, to kill this person to protect society.
Right, when we have these huge, I don't know what I can't remember what the term is for them, triple max prisons or whatever, like where they have, rows and rows of barbed wire and all these, cameras and guards and dogs and everything and concrete walls. Society is safe from them. And I think that's the key. Like you said, first world countries. We here, if you capture a criminal who's done some heinous crime and they're able to be locked away and kept, and you can keep society safe, then there's no reason to kill them afterwards. And that's exactly what the Catechism lays out, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And Jeanette DeMello, she's the editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register, she commented on this, and she said, while we recognize that the Church has allowed for the legitimate use of the death penalty for society's self-defense, we find that it's harder and harder to argue that a particular act of capital punishment is circumstantially necessary today in contemporary America. And I thought that was a nice kind of summary of exactly what the the Catechism says and kind of what we just were talking about.
Right.
So we can avoid this, basically.
And this is an issue that I think John Paul II really challenged us to rethink, because it was under JP2 that the Catechism was changed and there was an addition added, and what he added to the Catechism was that the cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically non-existent.
Exactly.
And so he was really challenging us to say, do we really need this? And that's been affirmed by Pope Benedict and then by Pope Francis. We're really called to grapple with this. And we've seen the bishops in the U.S., really question this as well. We have Archbishop Coakley in Oklahoma City, Archbishop Chaput in Philadelphia, Cardinal O'Malley. There's been a number of them who have really said, it's time to re-examine this. Let's just step up and give this an honest look.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I think there's a lot of quotes that we could share with you. But yeah, that Saint John Paul II quote in 1997 where he added to the Catechism, I thought that was particularly interesting because the Catechism was already out and he added to it. He felt that it was so important to make some sort of statement on this, especially with so many people being incarcerated and saying, hey, you have been sentenced to the death penalty. I think it's really important with that expanding view. Our prisons are getting so full, and it kind of seems like we need to just switch viewpoints on what we need to focus on in order to stop people from committing these heinous crimes in the first place, and then if you get the problem at the root, you don't have to deal with these types of things. But I think this is definitely a good step in the right direction.
And it's particularly timely because the Supreme Court is actually going to rule this year in a case about lethal injection protocol and whether or not that's considered cruel and unusual punishment. So basically last year we had this string of botched executions, some really gruesome stuff with people who didn't die when they were supposed to, people who lived for a couple hours,
had horrific heart attacks, like awful stuff.
And they were seen gasping for breath, and it just didn't work the way it was supposed to. And so it was after that Archbishop Coakley called for a re-examination of it. And another point that I thought was just really interesting is several of the bishops have said that this is really a matter of human dignity, that when you allow the death penalty and it's not necessary, you're eroding the reverence for the sanctity of human life, and that has other implications, because when our culture doesn't respect life, then we allow things like abortion and some of these other things to happen. So it is, even though technically the death penalty can be allowed, sometimes there's this web of interrelated issues that are all sort of held up by the culture of life and whether or not our culture respects life.
Absolutely. All these issues that we talk about are kind of tied together with this fine little thread, right? They all interact with each other. And yeah, I think it's important, the nuances, like you were just talking about. There are nuances to this, right? Like if somebody is trying to kill you, you have the right to defend yourself with equal force, right? And so that's another case, right? So it's just, you got to think about this, like you said, all the interconnected, all the other different moral implications that this has. And yeah, I agree. The view on the sanctity of human life is a big thing. And I hadn't really thought about that until I read this article. And one of the other things that I really got about this editorial also was that, Catholics really must unite together and fight for this, right? We need to stand up. We need to be vocal about it. We can't be complacent about it. So I think it's important to voice our opinions. And they really showed us, hey, this is, we're coming together to voice our opinions. They're doing their part.
That's very true. One last point on this. Sometimes there's this idea that the death penalty can bring closure to the families of victims. And this editorial cited a group of sisters who holds an annual event for victims and for the families of victims who have been killed. And that group said that none of the mothers there ever want the death penalty. Their children have been killed, and they say, I don't want the death penalty against the aggressor because I don't want any other mother to go through what I've had to go through. So I thought that was a really powerful testimony against the death penalty from people who have been affected by murder.
Absolutely. And not to mention, sometimes there's innocent people that get put on death row and are killed.
Absolutely. Yep,
so it's just a tough situation all around.
Absolutely. In our next story, Pope Francis has spoken out against Western nations using wealth and influence to push ideas about gender on poor countries.
Interesting. The viewpoint of basically saying that these powerful nations are the ones pushing the viewpoint. Because we live in the United States and we're one of the powerful nations in the world, it's hard. I don't think about it from like a different viewpoint, I guess. So it was interesting that he started from that side.
Right. Yeah. There was. It was very interesting. He was talking, this was during, he spoke about this initially on his flight home from the Philippines, and he was returning during this press conference, and he talked about ideological colonization. And so you think of colonization in these nations going out and trying to colonize other nations. And he's saying, now this is happening with ideologies. These wealthy Western countries are coming into the developing nations. And the Pope says they colonize the people with an idea that changes or wants to change a mentality or a structure. And so he's saying this is particularly happening when they're tying foreign aid money to ideas, and so you can only accept, you'll only get this money to help, you know, rebuild you out of poverty if you also accept some of these gender ideas about there's no difference between men and women, gay marriage is okay, that type of thing. Yeah, absolutely, and I think that happens here in the U.S. too with government funding too. They say if you don't push what we say you need to push, then we're not going to fund you anymore. You know, regarding homosexual marriage and things like that. And so yeah, I never thought it's a really interesting viewpoint about colonization, that idea, like just visualizing colonization, and then the ideological colonization. I think that's really, that's a good point, because that's exactly what happens. And it really is the powerful nations that are the ones that are responsible for that, right? Because they have the resources and can put the people on the ground. And I'm assuming, I can only assume that these more impoverished nations kind of are like, oh, cool, we're going to accept whatever you bring us. And so they're probably very accepting to the idea as well. It's very dangerous all around. Right, yeah, and the Pope said that he saw this in action. He saw it happen where a woman wanted to go down and build schools in a poor country and was told you can only get this funding if you're going to promote these ideas. And she said, okay, I'll do it. And so in particular, the Pope said this is happening with children. There's sort of this push to get these ideas into the minds of children in order to shape them with ideas that are very much contrary to the culture and to their way of beliefs and their moral system. Right. And the Pope said that the African bishops have also raised this concern. They say that it's happening there quite a bit. And the really harsh words that the Pope had, he compared this to Hitler Youth, the Nazi training program. And genetic manipulation and all kinds of other things that were kind of like, whoa, really, it's that crazy. Very strong words. But it's so important because, like you were just talking about, education of young children and kind of, you're basically building people from the ground up with these ideologies that are just completely off base and not in line with Christian beliefs. Right, right, and basically it's telling the people you can't have your Christian beliefs. You're not developed enough. Being developed means you have to accept our beliefs and that type of thing. And so, with this push that men and women are interchangeable, there's no difference, we're going to sort of deny any kind of biological reality. These nations are very, very, very much opposed to that, and they're saying, no, that's not part of our culture. That's not what we want. That's not what we believe. Don't push that on us. Right. And basically, they're being told either you will accept this view, or you're not going to get the funding that you need to survive. I think that's just rude, isn't that? I think it's just rude. That's like the first thing that I think. I'm like, that's horrible. That's just horrible. It also kind of mirrors Christianity, how Christ says, go forth and proclaim the gospel. This is almost like the reverse of that, right? Or the mirror image, like of the opposite. Interesting. It's like, they want to go out and basically undo everything, and they're using this money and power and wealth and everything to force it on people and put them in these hard positions. And that's what happens a lot of times in impoverished countries. We've talked about that before with like child sex labor and everything like that, sex slaves. Yep. That people are just so strapped for money that they're just like, man, I have to do this or else I can't live, And so it's just awful that people have to be put against each other like that for just because of their circumstances. Absolutely, absolutely. Coming up after the break, how does 50 Shades of Grey affect the culture? We'll discuss that next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Patrick Cordova. And I'm Michelle Bauman. In our next story, more questions are being raised about 50 Shades of Grey, this time about the impact of the book and movie on culture. Very interesting. We've been talking about 50 Shades of Grey, sort of the pornographic just vision that it's presenting and some of the different implications of it, some of the abuse aspects of it. And so this is really questioning, what is the impact on culture? How is this shaping our minds, our hearts? How is this shaping children, that kind of thing? So we actually were able to get some quotes from Dr. Christina Lynch, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and founding board member of the Catholic Psychotherapy Association. Yeah. She said this: there appears to be a dissonance in the psyche or soul of this current culture. On the one hand, outrage is expressed through the media and the public by the marked increase of sexual assaults on college campuses and the sexual trafficking of women across the globe, including in the US, while at the same time, films such as 50 Shades that appear to rationalize rather than condemn such activity are promoted as heroic and normal.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, right? It is like that. You have all this outrage about these horrible things that are happening on college campuses and sexual assaults and things like that. And then on the other hand, you have all this media attention and hype and like everybody's all like this, just I don't know, just this excitement about 50 Shades of Grey that was a book originally becoming to the big screen, and they push the same thing, right? So it's like why is it that in one segment of a news show, right, you could be like, oh my gosh, all these horrible things happened on this college campus, and then in the next segment you could be like, oh, there's this 50 Shades of Grey thing, be all pumped up about it, when really it's just doing what was happening practically on that college campus.
And remember, we even covered a story recently where this student was arrested because he specifically said he was trying to act out 50 Shades of Grey, and he was arrested for sexual assault.
Yes.
So this is not just a comparison that we're making. This is literally happening, where people are trying to live it out. But wait, when it's lived out, it's not some kind of sexy or romantic thing that's being shot at nice camera angles with music playing.
Right.
It's assault.
It makes tons of money for
assault,
people.
Exactly. And so I think this is, I think really Dr. Lynch just hits it on the head here. There's this really disjointed view that our culture has while we're glorifying this on one hand and then criticizing it on the other.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's the main point really in what she said. And you can really see the effects of it, right? It affects society. And that's really why a big reason of why we're talking about this, right? When you just movies and things like that, when people see movies and experience things, you absorb a lot of your environment and kind of become your environment. So it's really important to watch who you hang out with and who you socialize with and who you spend most of your time with, because it's so true. And I've heard that for a while from many different people, not just like my parents or anything, but like other people,
Absolutely,
and I knew a wealthy person. He said, if you want to be wealthy, add up the 3 salaries of the people you hang out with the most and average them out. He's like, that's probably what you make, And so it's just to point out that who you hang out with, what you take in and what you hear and what you say. These things matter to you, right? They kind of become an imprint of who you are, and they're hard to shake.
Yeah, you soak it up. I mean, I went to a college in Texas, and I would come back and my family would be like, you sound like a Texan, but
right.
You sort of absorb people's way of talking, way of thinking. It does impact you. And Dr. Lynch says here, she actually cites Dr. Miriam Grossman, a child and adolescent psychiatrist, who argues that films such as 50 Shades of Grey will sow confusion about what constitutes a morally sound, emotionally healthy sexual relationship. And I think that's what you're talking about, is you absorb this, and then that influences you very subtly, and then you're just not quite sure what to make of it anymore when these things factor into your real life.
Right, and it gives people the wrong idea, right? It gives men the wrong idea that, hey, I should be doing these sorts of things, sexual acts, and then women are going to like that. But in reality, women don't like that, as you can see by all the college experiences and things that have been coming out, all these stories. And then women also get confused. I think they take this and they go, oh yeah, maybe that's what it's supposed to be like. And then obviously they don't enjoy it.
It's so messy.
And then it just messes people's psyche up, and totally, I think it just destroys the idea of what a relationship should be like that.
One final quote from Dr. Lynch: movies don't merely reflect culture, they form culture. Human beings form meaning and values in life by the stories we internalize. I think that's exactly what you've been saying. That sums it up well.
Yeah, exactly. I think that sums it up well. I don't know if we could say anything more about that, but you really soak that up and you become it. So.
Absolutely.
Yep. All right, stay tuned. We have one more story coming up after the break. Hello and welcome back to Heroic Media. In our final story, one New York Times opinionator shares his thoughts on why our kids don't think moral facts exist, citing education as the primary culprit. So this is it. Interesting to see this on the New York Times, and this viewpoint is the first thing I thought when I read this piece. And I didn't realize also after reading this the extent of how our education is kind of pushing this view, because I really thought that for the most part it had to do with kind of like you know, our distancing from religion as a society as a whole, you know, and falling away from Christian morals and values and principles and things like that, not being taught, and education and families falling apart. And I'm sure all those things have a part in it. But also, you know, he shares some experiences with, and his name is Justin P. McBrayer. He's a New York Times, it's a New York Times opinion page. And he shares some thoughts with like some experiences that his child had when he went to his second grade son's school and saw some things up on the board. And I just thought it was really fascinating. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So just to give a little bit of background here,
yes.
He's talking about posters in a second grade classroom,
yes.
and they're trying to distinguish fact from opinion. And so there's one poster that says fact, something that is true about a subject and can be tested or proven.
Right.
Opinion, what someone thinks, feels, or believes.
Yes.
And the problem with this is that it's setting up a false dichotomy. It's saying
yes.
either it's true and it can be proven true, or it's something that you believe.
Right.
And so there's no room for it to be both. There's no
right.
room for it to be something that you believe and something that is true, or something that you can't prove. So,
exactly. And things, of course, we know from experience that in history and everything, that things can be true even if no one can prove them, right? And so we have to be, it's really scary, but the whole system of this, right? You know, it's in a second grade classroom. That was the first thing that stood out to me, because like we talked about in the previous story, you know, somebody that, or 2 stories ago rather, it's just that, you know, you can really educate people when they're really young and get these ideas ingrained in their mind. And it's no wonder that most college-age students nowadays don't have any idea of morals. They just think that it's an opinion based on a particular group of people. Hey, they have this opinion, they have this opinion,
exactly.
and basically any moral truth is just an opinion.
Exactly,
right?
Because moral truths cannot be proven
right.
or tested. And so, you know, something as basic for our society as killing is bad. Really, prove it. Oh, you can't prove that. You can't scientifically test it. Therefore, it's just an opinion.
Exactly.
But how can our society function if we can't hold that any moral truths are really true?
Right.
And so that's the basic premise. What he's saying here, he's saying no wonder we've got all this generation that only believes in relativism, because that's what we're teaching them. This is a huge
exactly.
problem. And you know, what about ISIS? You know, oh, well, is it wrong? Can you say it's wrong to kill people, to behead people and burn people alive if they don't agree with you?
It's just their opinion.
Exactly.
That's
and
just
this is a huge problem. And you know, it really raises an interesting question. How do we reconcile different beliefs? What if there is a group out there that doesn't think that X is wrong, but Catholics think it is wrong? And what the Catechism actually tells us is that the answer lies in something called natural law.
Yes.
And natural law is something that's so fundamental, it's written on our hearts. No matter what your belief system, no matter how you were raised, you just intrinsically know that's messed up.
Yes.
And I think that we see this with ISIS, with some of their more horrific executions. It doesn't matter what faith tradition you belong to. It doesn't matter what background. You look at that and there's something in you that just absolutely just recoils from it. And that's natural law. That's what the Catechism tells us.
Yeah, and it's not only in the Catechism, but it's also in Scripture too. And it talks, I don't remember who exactly it is that's saying it, but it's in the New Testament, and it speaks about, you know, the law that was written on their hearts, and speaking specifically about the Gentiles that didn't have the laws, and or any law or anything, talking about the natural law, which is exactly what you're talking about. And I'm pretty sure the Catechism references that Scripture passage. But yeah, it was kind of scary, like reading some of the things. So I just want to give some examples of what, like, so this is all also tied into Common Core, because that's where the school that his kid is going to, they follow the Common Core practices, which a lot of schools do, a lot of public schools, and a lot of private schools even too. And so here are some things. So, they were supposed to basically say whether these things are either facts or opinions, right? And so let me give you some examples. So he said to his son this, right, to kind of disprove him, right? He said, I believe that George Washington was the first president. Is that a fact or an opinion? And he goes, well, it's a fact. And his son says, it's a fact. And he said, well, the dad said, but I believe it. And you said that what someone believes is an opinion. And then his son said, yeah, but it's true. And his dad said, so it's both a fact and an opinion? And so basically, you can see here that just right then it stopped his son in his tracks, and he was like, wait, what? Yeah, I guess I didn't think about that, right? So a lot of times when there's teachings like this, and just like Pope Francis was talking about this indoctrination of ideology and everything, if you just stop and think about it just a little bit and try to hash it out, you'll see how it's a contradiction in and of itself, like when you just try to apply the teaching, right? And that's what his father talked about too, just like in the materials that the students were given for, like, you know, their student handbook and stuff. It's like, well, what you're teaching them in their class violates what the student handbook says, because, you know, it's basically it's just trying to push a bunch of opinions, you know? And so you really get in sticky, you know, the ground falls apart right underneath you when you're trying to teach something that isn't true, you know, at its core.
Absolutely, and this really has really significant implications when we're talking about human dignity, because if you really believe that you can't make moral judgments on anyone else, then you're going to say, oh, well, you know, maybe there's a culture out there, maybe there are people who really want to execute those who don't agree with them, who want to oppress women, who want to do all these things. I can't say anything about that. If you believe that abortion is okay and I don't, those are just two opinions. There's no reality about it.
Yeah.
And so human dignity is where this becomes really tricky, and
Yes.
that's where the natural law comes in, that we can use reason
Yes.
to say, wait a second, there's something about the human being that has dignity. So what the Catechism says here: the natural law present in the heart of each man and established by reason is universal in its precepts, and its authority extends to all men. It expresses the dignity of the person and determines the basis for his fundamental rights and duties. So that's something by which all men, whether, you know, whatever their beliefs, can say, you know what, there's something about the human person that shouldn't be violated, and there are certain acts that go against that.
Yeah, and it's interesting how when everything gets so watered down, where you're like, you don't want to offend anybody, you know, which is kind of what this teaching seems like, right?
Right.
Like it's just rooted in, it might be rooted in kind of a good thing, like you don't want to offend people, yeah, sure, but you can't do that at the expense of truth, right? So you can't say these moral, you know, just relativism in general, whatever you believe is the truth and whatever I believe is the truth, right? Because like you said, it'll come down to a human level, a natural law level, and at that point you will realize that isn't the truth. That's not the way it is.
There are some beliefs that are false. If you believe you are a duck and I believe you are a human, those can't, like, one of those is true and one of those isn't. So just because some beliefs are true and some beliefs are false.
Exactly. And so just to be clear, the progression that it follows, that this teaching follows, it says claims are either facts or opinions. All values and moral claims are opinions. Therefore, there are no moral facts or moral truths. So that's basically how you step through the logic of what this is, and that's how so many people, through the education system at least, are becoming to believe that, well, moral truths are not, there is no such a thing. There can't be, based on this logic. And it gets ingrained into people. It's really scary.
Absolutely, yeah. So good to be aware of this, good to be aware of what's going on in the education system, and to be aware of how it forms us, and if we've gone through that type of education, or just to see how the culture is getting into, you know, our own minds and our own perspectives on things, so that we can resist that, and so we can know what the church teaches and how to apply that. Yep,
and as always, you can, you know, rely on the sacraments to strengthen you and guide you spiritually and help you through this. But yeah, it's really important to know what your kids are being taught.
Absolutely.
All right, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please visit our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can check out more stories like the ones we discussed on this episode.
That's it for this time. Until next week, keep us in your prayers.
God bless.